Thank you for joining me today. This presentation is going to summarize the experiences of several rural and remote communities across Canada with their early endeavors into biomass energy. The presentation is based on the findings of interviews that were carried out earlier this year as a part of a Canma Energy project by myself, Jean Blair, and project lead Semna Madrali. The findings of the interviews were also published as a series of 4 articles in Canadian Biomass Magazine under the title Remotely Powerful, so I encourage you to check those out after this presentation. The findings in the articles are sort of more general and provide quite a bit of detail as to what we found in the interviews, whereas this presentation is going to focus more so on the findings as they relate to wood pellets and wood pellet supply chains, as well as the decision of which biomass fuel to use. The purpose of the interviews was really to learn more about the experiences of remote communities with biomass energy systems, including both biomass heat-only boilers as well as combined heat and power systems. More specifically, we were interested in what the motivations were for switching to biomass, what has worked or maybe not in terms of system design, biomass fuel supply, and day-to-day operations and maintenance, and what unique challenges might exist for northern remote communities, both in terms of technical and system design challenges, but also operational challenges relating to sort of the capacity of those in the community to install and operate the biomass systems. There was a total of 9 communities interviewed. All the communities are Indigenous. Most are in the far north. Most are also off-grid, so they rely on diesel generators. And several are actually at or above tree line, which makes sourcing biomass locally a challenge, while others are in forested areas. But none of the communities interviewed at the time being have an active local forest sector, though they might have in the past or are working on establishing one now. In all of the communities, diesel or heating oil was the fuel replaced, and in all of the communities except Ouijiboujimou in Quebec, the systems have been installed within the last 4 years, so the communities really are still in the learning phase of their operations. All communities also have a community government, and in all cases it is this community government which owns and is responsible for operating the biomass heating systems. So here I just wanted to give an example of what one of the communities that has installed biomass heating system looks like. So the community pictured here is Wapmagoosty, Quebec. They are a very remote northern Cree community with no road access. And as you can see, they're sort of right at tree line and thus have opted to use black pellets as their biomass feedstock. Currently, this community heats their sports complex as well as a greenhouse, I believe, using these black wood pellets. But they are planning to also use the pellets to fuel an ice making machine for their arena in the future, which is kind of a neat application that not everyone would think about for biomass. So here's another one of the communities interviewed. This is Quadacha, BC, and they are the one community that opted to install a combined heat and power system. So I'll get to details on that in just a few minutes. So Quadacha is in the heart of the region that's affected by the mountain pine beetle outbreak. And so they've opted to use this beetle-killed wood as feedstock for their bioenergy system. And you can see in the picture some of the dead standing trees that are located within very close proximity to the community. So the motivations for communities to develop biomass energy projects varied somewhat between communities, but there was also definitely some overlap. Most communities, for example, stated a desire to move towards more self-sufficient energy generation as a primary driver for the project, both in terms of the fuels they're using. They would like to reduce their dependence on imported fossil fuels, but also in terms of the opportunity to own their own energy infrastructure. Several communities also stated that local economic development was a primary driver, particularly those that have developed a local wood chip supply chain, while others stated that reducing the cost of energy production was a driver for their community. And in this case, it is generally the communities that are using wood pellets, which tends to be a lower cost feedstock, as their fuel. Several communities also stated that living off the land was a major driver for the project, as was reducing their ecological footprint. Interestingly, though, none of the communities stated specifically that greenhouse gas reduction was a driver for their project, although certainly funding for these projects may be tied to greenhouse gas reduction, as it definitely is an important factor for higher levels of government. Several communities also stated that mitigating risks related to the burning of fossil fuels, as well as diesel spills and oil contamination, were major drivers for their project. Because if they're using biomass as a fuel, then that all but eliminates the risks of diesel spills. So just a few details about the bioenergy systems themselves. In all cases, heat is the primary output of the system. In Quadacha, they've actually taken a bit of a risk and installed combined heat and power systems, which is the first example of a CHP being installed in a remote community in Canada. So far, their experiences have been pretty good, although there's certainly been some challenges and a steep learning curve. So this particular system consists of 3 45 kilowatt spanner gasification CHP units, and it's in an energy block, as you can see there. In all other communities, heat-only boilers are used. Most of the communities use 2 or more standard certified European boilers, and many communities stated that redundancy, or having multiple boilers in the system, is especially important in remote communities. So the capacity of the bioenergy systems installed in the communities interviewed ranges from about 60 kilowatts to just under 4 megawatts, so a relatively small scale. And in most cases, it's just a few buildings within the communities that are heated with biomass. With one exception, Ouija Bojamu heats their entire community using biomass through a district heating system. So on that note, there are some communities that have decided to use district heating networks to distribute heat to multiple buildings. And while there's some cost involved in doing this, it does help to increase scale, which is especially important for communities using wood chips, which I'll get back to later in the presentation. Of course, the buildings in a community are not always laid out in a way that district heating makes sense, and it can be quite costly to lay the pipe. So some communities have instead opted to install smaller boilers in multiple buildings. And in the communities interviewed, all of the communities that have individually heated buildings use pellet boilers. And again, I'll get to the significance of this a little bit later in the presentation. So just to give an idea of the buildings themselves that these energy systems are installed in some cases, communities have built sort of a custom, we'll call it an energy house, with a built-in fuel storage area that feeds automatically into boilers which are housed in the same building, usually on the other side of a concrete wall. Generally, the communities that have built these custom sort of energy houses use a chip feedstock, whereas the communities that are using pellets have their boilers installed either in a container, as you can see on the right there, just outside the building, or sometimes even right in the building itself, with the pellets stored in a silo adjacent to where the boilers are housed. This works for pellets because pellets flow easily through the silo, and the silo works really well as a fuel storage and feed system for the pellet boilers, but doesn't work so well for chips. So as for the fuels used in the biomass heating systems in the communities interviewed, 4 communities have opted to use white wood pellets, and of those, 2 have the pellets bulk delivered, and another 2 have actually established their own bulk delivery systems, which we'll get to again in a little bit. 4 communities use wood chips, 1 uses sawmill residues, and there are 3 that have actually established their own local wood chip supply chains using locally available residues, whether it's mountain pine beetle killed wood, wood from land clearing, or fire killed wood. And finally, the 9th community has opted to use black or torrefied wood pellets from Airex and Trois-Rivières, and this is a new application of black wood pellets in Canada, so it's kind of an exciting application. When it comes to the decision of which fuel to use in a biomass energy system, the answer is always going to be community specific and very much dependent on the regional context and local geographies. there are sort of three categories of possible biomass fuels that could be used. The first being forest sector residues, so residues either from a sawmill or potentially from harvesting. And these generally are going to be the lowest cost feedstock if they're available in the region, but there might still be some work and cost required in making sure that these residues are of the appropriate quality. The second option would be to establish a local wood chip supply chain specifically to supply biomass for energy, or to source bulk wood pellets, and we'll group both white wood pellets and black wood pellets within this category. So if there are local forest sector residues available, this is probably the first option to look at. If not, then the communities have the decision to make between establishing their own wood chip supply chain or sourcing bulk wood pellets. So I've put together just sort of some factors to consider based on what we heard from the communities. This is not a prescription by any means. It's just sort of some pros and cons and things to think about for each of the supply chains. So I'll work my way through this table in the next few slides. So the first thing to consider is that establishing a local wood chip supply chain in a region where there is no active forest sector is going to be fairly expensive. You're going to need equipment to harvest the forest material, to transport it, to chip it, to store it, possibly to dry it. And generally, the communities that have established their own local supply chains, energy costs might be sort of on par with their diesel heating costs, but they're not usually saving any money. Wood pellets, on the other hand, generally result in a lower heat cost than diesel or heating oil, especially if they're bulk delivered. Establishing a local wood chip supply chain does create significant employment opportunities for locals in the harvesting and processing of the biomass fuel and managing the supply chain. And in most cases, the skills that are required for these jobs are skills that the community members already possess, but are not necessarily paid to use. And in most cases, the people that are employed in the bush harvesting the biomass did not previously have employment or any sort of paid work. So it can be a really important thing for some of these communities who are in need of some local development opportunities. On the other hand, communities using wood pellets have seen fewer local jobs created, at least in the biomass fuel supply end of things. Although the establishment of a local bulk distribution company can certainly generate some economic opportunities, and we'll talk about that again in a few minutes. Another thing to consider is that scale is required in order to justify the cost of establishing a wood chip supply chain. In the communities interviewed, those that have established a local supply chain use somewhere in the neighborhood of about 1,000 tons per year of biomass. This is where district energy networks can really help to achieve that required scale to establish a local supply chain. On the other hand, if bulk delivery of wood pellets is available, for example, through regional hubs, small-scale systems and residential units become much more feasible. For example, there are communities with systems that are 150 kilowatts or less that, because they have bulk delivery available, the systems are still feasible and cost competitive with their fossil fuel heating systems. For communities that opt to establish a local wood chip supply chain, it's incredibly important that their biomass supply is sustainable not only now in the short term, but also over the long term, as these systems are going to be operating for the next 20, 30, even 40 years. Similarly, for those using wood pellets, if they're completely reliant on a single wood pellet producer and there really aren't any others in the area that could supply them, they need to think about what they would do if their pellet supplier closes. For communities using wood chips, the chip moisture and the general chip quality can be fairly difficult to control. In most of the communities interviewed, it's monitored by the operators of the system, though some communities have stated that this is a challenge and there needs to be some better sort of systems and checks in place to make sure that quality is maintained. Whereas pellet quality is going to be ensured in most cases by the company that's supplying the pellets. although the pellets can degrade if they're not properly stored. So it's important to make sure that there's a good storage system and that moisture is kept out and all that stuff. In communities with a local wood chip supply chain, ideally there will be dedicated operators that manage the daily operations of both the boilers as well as the fuel supply. And in most communities, this has actually generated sort of 2 to 4 full-time jobs right within the community, because it's a fair bit of work to manage the supply chain and the chipping and the drying of the fuels. In communities that use wood pellets, the boilers are generally operated by existing community staff, such as a public works or maintenance staff, and that seems to work pretty well because there's much less work involved in organizing the biomass fuel supply. It's just sort of a bulk delivery once in a while. So now we'll just get into some details on sort of pellet logistics and things to think about in remote communities. In general, remote communities are very much accustomed to the logistical challenges related to fuel and food supply, and pellets, of course, are no different. So it's very important that the supply chain is planned from the outset of the project. In most cases, pellets are still going to be economical relative to diesel or perhaps heating oil, even if the pellet mill is several hundred kilometers away. But the communities do need to have some sort of bulk storage capacity, potentially to last the entire heating system, depending on how accessible the community is. In order to keep costs reasonable, it's a good idea to limit the number of bulk deliveries from the producer. So again, having a bulk storage capacity helps with that. And in some cases, torrefied or black pellets might be considered due to their improved storage properties. The one community that does use black pellets, Wapmagoosty, they tested both white pellets and black pellets, stored them in a container that I think was watertight but maybe not airtight, inside of a warehouse, and found that the white pellets over the course of the heating season actually degraded into like a mush type substance, so that didn't work so well. Whereas the black pellets seemed to work just fine, and it just required a few little tweaks to the boilers, which happened before the boilers were installed to be able to accommodate the black pellets. So might be an option for communities who are very remote and need to store pellets for a long time, and maybe don't have the most advanced storage systems. So we're just going to take a quick look at what some of these pellet supply chains look like in the communities that were interviewed. So Wati is a community in the Northwest Territories, sort of northwest of Yellowknife. And in Wati, they have their pellets delivered once a year on their winter road, which of course is only open for a few short weeks in the winter, directly from La Crete. So they get sort of one truckload of pellets from the Crete in northern Alberta, which is more than 800 kilometers away. The pellets are stored in a silo. They're white pellets, and storing them in the silo has seemed to work just fine for Wati with no problems of degradation, even over the course of an entire heating season. And that system has worked pretty well for them. So, Kaji 2 is another community in the Northwest Territories, somewhat further south than the community of Wati, and about 180 kilometers from Hay River, where there is actually local entrepreneurs have established a bulk delivery service. So Kaji 2 receives their pellets from this bulk distributor in Hay River, sort of on an as-needed basis, a few times a season, very similar to how you might receive a propane or fuel oil shipment. So Wapmagoosty is another very remote community located on the southeast shore of the Hudson Bay. They're the ones that use the torrefied pellets because of the issues storing white pellets in containers. They have their pellets delivered also just once a year. In this case, the pellets are trucked from Trois-Rivières up to Wemingee and then barged up to Wapmagoosty from there and stored, as I said, in containers in a warehouse. In the community of Okwamacong, Ontario, there's a local truck driver who is employed on a casual basis to pick up truckloads of super sacks from the pellet producer in Hearst. Super sacks are then stored in a warehouse in the community. and transferred into the bulk delivery truck that was purchased into the community to deliver to all the local buildings as needed. The community is actually in the process of developing a pellet mill in Nairn Centre, which is about 100 kilometers north of Wikwemikong. That will be the source of their pellets in the future, but for now they're getting them from Hearst, which is about 700 kilometers away, and it's still working. And finally, in the community of Giksand, British Columbia, the Giksand Development Corporation has established a subsidiary company, Giksand Energy Inc., which acts as a bulk delivery service for Giksand Nation and the surrounding area. And right now the pellets are being picked up from Skeena Bioenergy, which is about 150 kilometers away, but this community is also in the process of developing their own pellet plants, which will be the source of their pellets in the future. And they also plan to establish somewhat of a biomass distribution hub where they will offer delivery of not just pellets, but also wood chips and potentially black pellets also in the future. And the neat thing about this service is that they deliver not only to the community boilers that have been established in the community, but also to residential customers within the region. So this has also resulted in sort of some spin-off economic development where some local entrepreneurs have picked up on the opportunity and started producing these sort of pellet storage bins for residential customers, and have made a bit of a spin-off business out of these pellet storage bins that has only been made possible because of this bulk distribution service being available. So just give you a little bit of detail on sort of what a local pellet distribution company is. It's very similar to the way that a propane or fuel oil distributor works. So these companies will source bulk pellets from a producer. Most of them will have some sort of bulk storage capacity available on site, and they'll have a delivery truck. So the delivery trucks, here's a picture of Giksand Energy's delivery truck, but it's sort of just a big fuel truck with a blower system, so you can see the pellets being blown out the back there, or out the top there, and into the building right beside the truck. So these trucks, it's economical for them to deliver to pellet boilers within about 150 or so kilometer radius. They can do residential customers as well, as I mentioned earlier. And essentially, they just blow pellets into a silo or other pellet storage or feed system. And in the communities interviewed, both Giksand and Wikwemikong have established their own bulk delivery system and purchased a truck for use within the community. And Kaji too, they haven't established their own bulk distributor, but they do take advantage of the fact that there is a bulk distributor in Hay River, and in fact their little 60 kilowatt system probably would not be possible if they didn't have access to this bulk distribution service. So on that note, some of the benefits of establishing a local pellet distribution company. The big one is that they allow for smaller scale bioheat systems than would be feasible if you're depending on bulk delivery directly from the producer. So they can supply residential scale systems and systems in the range of about 50 to 100 kilowatts, no problem, whereas a system of that size would not be able to economically source bulk pellets directly from the producer. So this really opens up the residential pellet market and provides a convenient and cost-effective pellet supply for residential customers, even those just using pellet stoves who don't want to deal with the bags, because they're really not much fun to deal with. And I really see these local pellet distribution companies as being essential for the growth of the domestic pellet market in Canada. So it's really great that these communities are able to sort of showcase that, to be able to show that, look, this works. It's generating opportunities in our community for employment. It's generating the growth of the domestic pellet market, and just sets a really good example that hopefully other communities will be able to follow and sort of start to really open up that domestic heating market for our pellet producers. And this slide I just included really to highlight the importance of having bulk storage capacity for communities that want to, or for companies that want to establish some sort of local bulk pellet distribution system. So the pictures here are of Wakwamacong's current supply chain. So they're picking up the pellets in super sacks, storing them in a warehouse, and then having to sort of jimmy up a way to get those sacks into the truck, and it's resulted in a lot of extra work and headaches for the public works staff and system operators. They've made it work, but they've said the first thing they need to do is install some big storage silos for the next season to make this all run much more smoothly. Most of the challenges they have been related to the use of these super sacks. So if you want to do the bulk delivery system, having that bulk storage capacity is really an important piece of the puzzle. So to conclude, wood pellets offer a convenient and relatively low-cost, low-carbon heating solution for rural and remote communities. And the establishment of a local distribution company can both generate jobs within remote communities, as well as improve the market penetration of pellets, allowing for smaller scale installations than would be otherwise possible. The pellet market in remote communities is relatively small, but successful operation of pellet heating systems or biomass heating systems in general in these remote communities can act as a really good proof of concept that hopefully other communities will pick up on and see that it's working here, so there's no reason why it shouldn't work in other communities across the country as well, especially those that don't have access to natural gas. And just some general findings, the use of community-based biomass energy systems in remote communities in Canada is relatively new, and most communities have only a few seasons of operational experience at most. Supply chains are very much still being established, and experience with the technology is being gained, but so far these experiences have overall been very much positive. So that's all that I've got for you today. If you're interested in learning more about the interviews with the rural and remote communities, please check out our Remotely Powerful series published online at www.canadianbiomassmagazine.ca. Thank you so much for your time.